Picture a room that smells like roasting coffee beans and pipe smoke and the particular kind of silence that 40 men make, when they are all pretending to be something they are not. Now fill it with rain-soaked wool coats steaming by the fire, with newspapers being read very carefully by men whose eyes keep moving above the page. Add a boy behind the counter who notices everything and says nothing, a fire burning too hot in the corner grate, and a door at the back that leads to another room, which leads to another version of the world entirely. That's a London coffeehouse in 1730. Not the one in the history books, where wigged gentlemen debate Newton and argue about Parliament over their cups. The other one. The one that existed underneath it, in the same walls and the same smoke-stained air, operating by its own laws and its own language and its own desperate arithmetic, in which the cost of being discovered was your neck, or the pillory, which was sometimes worse. 4 years ago, on the 22nd of May 1726, the constables broke down the door of a house in Field Lane, Holborn, and dragged out nearly 40 men in chains. The house belonged to a woman named Margaret Clap. Her customers were men who loved men. The newspapers called them sodomites. The court called them worse things still. 3 of them went to the gallows at Tyburn. Others stood in the pillory in Smithfield while the crowd threw stones and garbage and broken pottery until 2 of them were beaten half to death. 1 man lost an eye. The crowd cheered. The rest of London shuddered and went quiet and tried to forget it had ever happened. But the men who had known Margaret Clap's house, who had known what it was to be in a room where you didn't have to pretend, they didn't forget. They reorganised. They dispersed. They found new rooms and new signals and new ways to exist in the open without being visible. They moved the whole invisible country of themselves into the coffeehouses and the bookshops and the park paths, and they made it smaller and harder to find and more elaborate in its protections. This is the world you've been circling for a year without knowing it. We're going back there tonight. Not as observers watching from a comfortable distance. We're living it. 1 man, 1 city. 1 ordinary Tuesday in February that turns into something you will spend the rest of your life measuring other days against. So I make these history stories, and honestly I have no idea whether any of you listen to them because you want to sleep, or because you want to feel less alone in whatever it is you carry, or both. Which is probably the most human answer. Either way, get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. Here we go. Your name is Thomas Marsh. You're 22 years old and you have been in London for 11 months. And every single one of those months has been a kind of negotiation between the person you arrived as and the person the city keeps insisting you could become. You came from Bristol. Your father is a chandler. Your mother keeps a decent house and a decent garden, and has 4 other children to worry about besides you, which makes you her easiest concern and her least understood one. You were good with letters from the time you were 6 years old, which got you into a grammar school on the charity of a local merchant, which got you a letter of introduction to a solicitor in Holborn named Robert Cavendish, which got you here. Here is a narrow room above a print shop on Cursitor Street, just east of Chancery Lane, where you sleep in a bed barely wide enough for your shoulders, and wake each morning to the sound of the printing press below, working through its first run of the day. You are a copying clerk. You copy documents. Legal documents mostly. Wills, conveyances, articles of agreement, depositions. Mr. Cavendish dictates, or hands you an original to copy in triplicate, and you copy. Your hand is good, clean and legible and fast. You can hold a pen for 6 hours without cramping. This is your skill. This is what Bristol sent London. You don't hate the work. You don't love it either. It's what you do between the moments when you're actually alive. London in February. You need to understand what that means before we go any further. The cold is a different animal here than it was in Bristol. Bristol had cold, obviously, honest cold, the kind that came off the water and sat in your chest. London cold is something meaner. It settles into the streets, which never quite dry because there's no sun to reach between the buildings, and it layers itself into your clothes, and it lives in the stone walls of Mr. Cavendish's office, where the one fire is always either roaring too hot on the side facing it, or not reaching you at all. Your hands are always cold. You've developed the habit of warming your fingers against the side of the oil lamp before you begin your morning's work. A small animal gesture you do without thinking now, pressing both palms flat against the glass for 10 seconds, feeling the heat seep in. The ink is the problem in this cold. It thickens. On the worst mornings, the first lines of your copying are slightly rough, slightly dragged, because the ink hasn't quite reached its proper consistency. You've learned to keep the inkwell close to the lamp. You've learned to test the nib before you begin. Small adjustments, small competencies, the kind of knowledge that is invisible until it's absent. This morning is a Tuesday in the second week of February 1730. Outside your window, which is small and looks onto the back passage between Cursitor Street and the lane behind it, the light is the particular grey of a London winter morning, which is not really light at all, but rather the absence of total darkness, a grudging acknowledgement that the sun exists somewhere beyond the coal smoke and the clouds. You're already dressed when the church bells begin. St. Andrew's Holborn is closest, then St. Bride's, further west, then the more distant bells of a dozen other churches marking the hour, overlapping and echoing off the rooftops until the whole city sounds briefly like it's underwater. 7 o'clock. Mr. Cavendish opens his office at 8. You have 1 hour. You're not going to spend it in your room. This is the thing about London that nobody in Bristol warned you about, and that you couldn't have understood anyway without living it. The city creates in you a constant low-level hunger for more of itself. Not the monuments, not the grand buildings, the texture of it, the way it feels to move through streets that are always doing something, that are always in some kind of transaction, that never quite sleep and never quite let you sleep either. On the worst days, this is exhausting. On better days, it feels like being alive in a way you weren't in Bristol. You pull your coat on over your jacket, wool, heavy, with a collar that comes up around your ears when you need it. You bought it second-hand from a stall in Cheapside for 3 shillings and 6pence. The previous owner was a larger man. The shoulders are slightly wrong, which means there's extra fabric that catches the wind, which means you're always slightly colder than you should be. Small discomforts. The texture of being a copying clerk in London, age 22 in February, down the stairs. The printing press is already going, the rhythm of it coming up through the floorboards in your room each morning like a heartbeat, and here at the bottom of the stairs the sound is louder. A heavy mechanical thump and hiss, and through the half-open door you can see 2 men working by lamplight, one feeding paper and one pulling the arm. A synchronized movement they've done so many times it has become elegant. They don't look up as you pass, out into Cursitor Street. The cold hits you immediately and completely, not gradually. In London in February, the cold doesn't introduce itself. It simply arrives, full force, the moment you step outside, as if it has been waiting for you on the other side of the door. The street is already busy, even at this hour, even in this cold. A cart piled with coal moving toward the Chancery Lane end. 2 women in heavy cloaks, heads down, walking quickly in the opposite direction. A boy chasing something, a dog maybe, disappearing around a corner before you can see what it is. The mud underfoot is half frozen, not solid enough to be clean, soft enough to still be mud. Your shoes break through a thin crust of ice with each step, sinking slightly, the cold seeping in through the leather. You walk west. You are walking toward coffee. There is a coffee house on Fleet Street, maybe 10 minutes' walk from Cursiter Street, called Addison's. Not the famous one, not the grand one. Addison's is what you might call a secondary establishment. It occupies the ground floor of a narrow building between a bookseller and a hatter, and it has been there, in various forms, since 1691. The sign above the door shows a coffee pot. The sign is old. The coffee pot on it is a style that nobody has made since the previous century. But nobody has changed the sign because the sign is the point. Everyone on this stretch of Fleet Street knows the sign. You've been coming here for 3 months. The reason you started coming here is embarrassingly mundane. You were cold. You had 40 minutes before Mr. Cavendish needed you. The fire in your room had gone out and would take 20 minutes to catch properly, and then another 20 to do anything useful, and you had exactly enough money for a cup of coffee, and Addison's was the nearest establishment. That was 3 months ago. The reason you keep coming is harder to explain. You push open the door. The smell hits you first, the way it always does, a wave of it, rich and slightly burnt and layered with things that have been smoking and steaming in this room for decades. Coffee, obviously, the particular earthiness of it, somewhere between soil and wood and something you have no name for that only coffee smells like. Tobacco on top of that. Pipe smoke that has soaked into the walls and the wooden ceiling and the fabric of the chairs so completely that the room would still smell of tobacco if you removed every pipe from it. And underneath that, the smell of men and damp coats and the tallow candles burning in their holders on the tables, a slightly animal smell. Not unpleasant exactly, just present. The smell of a room that has been lived in continuously for 40 years. You feel your shoulders drop slightly. You hadn't realised they were up. This happens every morning. Some architecture of tension you carry out of the grey street releases itself at this threshold, in this smell, before you've even seen who is here. The boy behind the counter is named Will. He is maybe 16, with a wide face and ears that stand out from his head at a notable angle, and eyes that are almost always slightly narrowed. Not from hostility, but from perpetual appraisal. He is watching the room, always watching the room, the way a good counterboy learns to do in a place where the clientele expects attentiveness without intrusion. He sees you come in. He doesn't nod. He doesn't speak. He just begins making your coffee. This is one of the small pleasures of routine. Being known without ceremony, you find your usual corner, a low table near the far wall, a bench along the wall, and a single chair across from it, positioned so that your back is to the wall and you can see the door. You chose this spot on your second morning here and have sat in it every morning since, and nobody else ever seems to want it, which suits you perfectly. The room at 7 in the morning is not yet full. 5 other customers, a lawyer's clerk you recognise by sight but don't know, bent over a pamphlet. 2 older men sharing a newspaper without speaking, each reading a different section. A domestic economy of silence. A heavy-set man in a wig that has seen better days, who is always here before you, and always here after you, and seems to be trying to give the impression that he is conducting business, when in fact he is mostly just sitting. And one man you don't recognise. He's sitting at a table toward the middle of the room, not reading, not talking to anyone. He's maybe 35, plainly dressed, a coat the colour of dried mud, No wig, his own dark hair tied back at the nape of his neck. He has a book open in front of him, but he's not reading it. He's looking at nothing in particular, or seeming to. You look at him for a moment longer than you should. Then Will arrives with your coffee. The cup is small. The coffee is hot enough that you can feel it through the ceramic when you wrap both hands around it, and you do, always, both hands, the heat spreading into your palms and then your fingers with something like relief. You hold it there for a moment before you drink. The first sip is bitter and slightly too hot and almost exactly what you need. You settle in. Outside, the bells of St. Bride's mark 1/4 past the hour. The room gradually fills, more clerks, more lawyers' men, a printer from the nearby press with ink on his wrists. The heavy-set man in the bad wig eventually speaks to no one in particular about the weather, as he does every morning, and receives polite non-committal noises in response, as he does every morning. The man in the mud-coloured coat is still there. He's turned a page in his book, or he was. Now he's not reading again. His gaze has moved slightly. It isn't on you, it's on the room in a general way, the same mild appraisal that Will behind the counter does, the same habit of watching. You look away. Here is the thing about living in London as a young man in 1730. The thing that Bristol didn't prepare you for, and that Mr. Cavendish's office, with its orderly rows of documents and its careful legal language, doesn't help with at all. You know something about yourself. You have known it, in the way you know things before you have words for them, since you were approximately 15 years old. You know it the way you know the temperature of a room when you walk into it, wordlessly, bodily, before your brain has formed a sentence about it. You've never said it out loud, not to anyone, not even to yourself, not in so many words. The words are dangerous. The words are the kind of thing that, if someone else hears you say them, changes the shape of your entire life. The words can get you killed. You know about the pillory at Smithfield. You know about Tyburn. The newspapers were very thorough in 1726, very thorough indeed, and you were in Bristol, 17 years old, and you read every word of every account in the paper your father bought that week, and then you put the newspaper in the fire with hands that were shaking slightly. So you know what you know and you don't say it, and you get through the days. You copy documents, you drink your morning coffee, you're careful about where you look, and for how long. Being careful about where you look and for how long is exhausting in a way that nothing else is. Will arrives to refill your cup. He sets it down and starts to leave and then pauses. He says something quiet, not quite looking at you, looking at the surface of the table. Man in the middle table's been watching you. You look at Will. Will is already gone, moving back toward the counter with the empty pot. You don't look at the man in the mud-coloured coat. You look at your coffee. Your heart is doing something unusual. This requires some explanation. The reason your heart is doing something unusual is not, or not only, that a man has been watching you. Men watch men in coffeehouses constantly. You watch men. Everyone watches everyone. It's a social institution. The coffeehouse is one of the only places in London where different classes of men sit together, where a duke's secretary and a printer's apprentice share a newspaper, where no one has a private room, and everyone is technically equal under the informality of commerce. Watching is part of what you do there. The reason your heart is doing something unusual is the way Will said it. Not warned you, not alerted you, said it. The way you say something to someone you think might find it useful information, handed over as a quiet gift, with the particular neutrality of someone who knows what they know and has decided to tell you. Will has worked at Addison's for at least 2 years before you started coming here. In that time, he has watched this room more carefully than anyone. He knows things. You still don't look at the man. You finish your coffee. You pay Will with 2 pennies. You pull your coat back on, your shoulders going up again against the cold before you're even at the door. You leave. You're 2 streets away before you realise you're walking quickly for no external reason. Mr. Cavendish's office is warm this morning, which is unusual. Someone built the fire up early. The room smells of wax and paper and the slightly sweet mustiness that old legal documents develop when they've been stored in rolls in their iron-bound boxes. A smell that is specific and pervasive, and that you have come to associate with the hours of your life spent sitting still. There are 3 documents to copy today: 2 conveyances for properties in Southwark and a deposition in a matter of debt. You set up your desk, warm your fingers against the lamp, unstop the inkwell, test the nib. You begin. The work takes your hands and releases your mind. This is the paradox of copying. Your hand moves, the pen scratches, the letters form, your eyes move from original to copy and back, and meanwhile the rest of your brain is entirely elsewhere. Today it is in Addison's. You think about the man in the mud-coloured coat. His age you'd put at 35 or perhaps a little older. Hard to say with men who have weathered faces from being outside often. Not a lawyer or a merchant's man. The coat was too practical for that. A bookseller maybe, or a printer, or a clerk of a different kind from yourself. You think about Will saying it. You think about what it means that Will said it, and specifically how Will said it, which is the thing you keep returning to. In 1730, the spaces where men like you exist are not invisible. They are hidden, which is different. Invisible things cannot be seen at all. Hidden things are there, if you know where to look, if you have the right kind of eyes. The City of London contains, folded inside the ordinary city that everyone can see, a smaller, more careful city with its own geography and its own customs and its own population. You've been circling the edge of this city for 11 months. You know it exists. You've been in Bristol and you've been in London and you've been in the grey spaces between knowing and not knowing, and you've learned to read certain things. The way certain men in certain streets look at each other and then away and then back. The particular pause in conversation when you say the wrong thing in the wrong way in front of the wrong person. The way some men relax very slightly in your presence and others very slightly tighten. You have never walked through the door. Not deliberately, not consciously. But maybe that's what this morning was. Maybe Will knows exactly what kind of morning it was. The pen moves. The document progresses. Outside the window of Mr. Cavendish's office, which looks onto Cursitor Street, the day develops its own unremarkable momentum. Carts, footsteps, the distant cry of a street vendor selling something you can't make out. You copy the words of a property deed and you think about a man reading a book without reading it. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Cavendish tells you to take the depositions to the Court of Chancery at Lincoln's Inn and deliver them to a clerk named Morton. This is a routine errand. You've done it perhaps 20 times since you arrived. You know the way well enough to take it without thinking. Along Holborn and down Chancery Lane to the inn, the stone buildings of it rising grey and solid around the courtyard. The smell of damp stone and the particular quiet of a place where important things happen at a very slow pace. You find Morton. You hand over the documents. Morton signs the receipt. You leave. It is now just past 3 o'clock. You're not expected back at Cavendish's until the following morning. Tuesday afternoons are yours. one of the small freedoms of your arrangement with Mr. Cavendish, who is a fair employer if not a warm one. You're standing on Chancery Lane with an afternoon in front of you. You turn toward Fleet Street. You tell yourself you're going to find a bookstall. There are several between here and St. Paul's, and you've been meaning to look for a particular pamphlet on surveying that Mr. Cavendish mentioned. This is a reasonable reason to walk in this direction. You hold on to it. The stalls along Fleet Street are sheltered under the eaves of the buildings on the south side of the street, facing north. And in February the light on the books is grey and flat, and you have to tilt the spines toward you to read them. You move along, touching spines, pulling out pamphlets, putting them back. The cold has hardened your fingers again, and you feel the edges of the pages more abstractly than you should. There are at least a dozen other people doing the same thing, the particular slow, distracted movement of people who are browsing rather than buying. The urban human activity of looking at things you might want but mostly won't purchase. The bookseller's stall has an owner who stands behind it with his arms crossed, and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He watches you the way booksellers watch customers who browse, which is to say with resigned patience and occasional strategic attention. This is not the bookseller you're interested in. This is a stall. There is, slightly further west, a proper shop, a narrow one squeezed between two taller buildings, with a sign above the door showing a quill and the name below it, E. Finch, bookseller and stationer. You have walked past this shop perhaps 15 times. You have never gone in. Today you go in. The bell above the door makes a small clean sound as you push it open, and the smell that meets you is particular and very different from Addison's, and yet has the same quality of making your shoulders drop. Old paper and binding leather, and the specific dustiness of books that have been in a room for a long time. Ink, dried, wood, a faint sweetness you can't identify, something floral and faint that might be from the paper or might be something being burned somewhere in the back. The shop is small, 2 walls entirely lined with shelves, a central table with more books laid flat, organised into some system you can't immediately read, a counter at the back with an oil lamp on it. Behind the counter, sitting on a stool, the man in the mud-coloured coat. He looks up when you come in. He looks at you the way he looked at you in Addison's. The same mild steadiness, not pointed or demanding, just present, seeing you. "Good afternoon," he says. His voice is low and unhurried, with an accent you can't quite place. Not London. Somewhere northwest, maybe. "Good afternoon," you say. You look at the shelves. You're looking for something. You're not sure what. You reach for a volume without looking at its title and turn it over and look at the spine, and it is a treatise on the anatomy of horses, and you put it back. "Looking for anything particular?" the man says. "I'm not sure yet." A pause. He doesn't fill it. You pick up a pamphlet, a political thing, printed last year. You put it back. "I've seen you at Addison's," he says. Not as an opening to more conversation, just as a statement. Something settled between you as fact. "I'm there most mornings," you say. "I know." Another pause. You look up from the books. He's watching you over the lamp with the same expression. But there's something in it now. A slight shift at the corners. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than a smile. "You should come in the afternoon sometimes," he says. "Addison's is different in the afternoons." You hold his gaze for a moment. "Different how?" you say. He reaches under the counter and produces a small glass of something amber. He sets a second glass on the counter and pours without asking. He looks at you. "Sit down," he says. His name is Edward Finch. He has kept the bookshop on Fleet Street for 6 years, having inherited it from an uncle who inherited it from a man who ran it as a pamphlet shop during the last years of the previous century. Edward is 34 years old. He was born in Manchester, came to London at 19. He has an assistant, a young man named Christoph who is Swiss and speaks acceptable English, and is apparently terrifying at arithmetic. Christoph is not here this afternoon. Edward is alone in the shop. He tells you these things in the same unhurried way he said good afternoon, offering information the way you offer something across a table, without pressure. You're sitting across from him with your glass of something that turns out to be brandy, which you were not expecting, and which warms the inside of your chest in a way the morning's coffee didn't quite manage. The shop is quiet around you. Outside on Fleet Street, the afternoon continues its grey business. Occasionally someone passes the window, a moving shadow through the low pane. "You've been in London how long?" Edward asks. 11 months. "From?" "Bristol." He nods. Something in the nod says he has heard Bristol before, from other people sitting in this same chair, that Bristol is one of the cities people come from. "Clerk," he says. "Copying clerk for a solicitor in Holborn." "Cavendish." You look at him. You know him. "I know most of the lawyers between here and Lincoln's Inn by professional necessity. I supply him with paper and ink and the occasional volume. Good man. Fair." He tilts his head slightly. "Is he good to you?" "Fair, you say. He leaves me Tuesday afternoons." "Hence." Edward gestures at the shop around you with a slight movement of his hand. "Hence, you agree. The brandy's very good. This surprises you. The shop doesn't look like a place that would have very good brandy. But then, you're learning that things in London are frequently different from what they look like." "Will," you say, and then you're not sure how to finish the sentence. Edward says it for you. Will is perceptive. Has been since he started here. A pause. "He worked for me before Addison's hired him." You hold this information. Will worked for Edward before he worked at Addison's. "So he knows," you say, carefully. "Will knows a great many things," Edward says. "He knows which customers to refill without being asked, and which ones want to be asked first. He knows which mornings the room is safe and which mornings it isn't." He looks at you directly. "He also knows, I think, which customers have been sitting alone for 11 months with something they don't quite have words for yet." The fire crackles in the corner. Outside, someone shouts something on Fleet Street, a vendor, a name, nothing significant. The sound of it recedes. You realize you've stopped breathing at quite the right pace. "You don't need to say anything," Edward says. His voice is very even. Not kind, exactly. More like honest. Like a man who has watched this conversation happen enough times that he can carry both sides of it if he needs to. "I'm not asking you to say anything. I'm telling you that Addison's on Tuesday afternoons, after about 3 o'clock, is a particular kind of room. I'm telling you that this is a particular kind of shop. I'm telling you that I know what it costs to sit alone with something that doesn't have words." He looks at his glass. "I'm also telling you that the brandy is from Bordeaux. It came in through Portsmouth 3 months ago in a rather roundabout way, and you should finish it because I don't offer it to everyone." You finish the brandy. You stay in Edward Finch's bookshop until the light outside the window has gone from grey to the darker grey that precedes true dark, and in that time you learn several things. You learn that Edward has been in London for 15 years and has known what he is for 20. That he knew a man named George who was taken in 1726 and stood in the pillory in Smithfield and survived the crowd's attention, but came away with a permanent tremor in his right hand that made him unable to write. That Edward has not been to Smithfield since, and does not go to watch anything that draws a crowd, and keeps his affairs conducted at a level of discretion that borders on the professional. You learn that there is a world in this city that operates below the visible one, and that it has rules as intricate as any legal document you've ever copied, and that the rules exist because the penalty for breaking them is catastrophic, in a way that very few things in ordinary life are catastrophic. You also learn that there is a man who comes to Addison's on Tuesday afternoons and Thursday evenings, and sometimes on Sunday mornings when the weather is too cold for St. James's Park. His name is James. He is a painter. Edward knows him well. You learn this last part from the particular way Edward does not emphasize it, which is the way you share information that is both important and not yours to offer in a larger form. You say good evening, you put on your coat. The bell above the door makes its small sound as you leave. On Fleet Street, in the dark and the cold, you stand for a moment. The street has its evening texture now, different from the morning's texture, the lamplighters making their rounds, the taverns beginning to warm and fill, the quality of footsteps changing from purposeful daytime movement to the slightly more oblique movement of evening. You walk back toward Cursitor Street. You do not feel different exactly. You feel like someone who has walked through a particular door and knows, with absolute clarity, that they cannot unwalk through it. That the room on the other side is now part of the floor plan of their life. You feel the cold through your coat, the one that's slightly too wide at the shoulders, the one you bought second-hand in Cheapside for 3 shillings and sixpence. Tomorrow is Wednesday. Wednesday you're at Cavendish's all day. The day after tomorrow is Thursday. Thursday evening, Addison's is a particular kind of room. The church bells mark the hour. Your breath makes a cloud in front of your face. Your feet navigate the half-frozen mud of Cursitor Street by feel, the way they have learned to do these past 11 months. You go upstairs to your room above the printing press. You're not hungry for supper tonight, which is unusual for you. You sit on the edge of your narrow bed and look at the wall. The wall has nothing on it, just plaster, slightly dirty, with a crack running diagonally from the window to the corner. You have looked at this crack every morning for 11 months. Tonight it looks different, which means nothing, which means everything. You lie down with your coat still on. Outside, the printing press below eventually stops. The room fills up with the relative silence of London at night, which is not silence at all, which is the sound of the city continuing without you, tavern noise and footsteps and a church bell somewhere, and the occasional cry of something you can't identify. You fall asleep faster than you expected to. Wednesday passes the way Wednesdays pass. You copy documents. You warm your fingers against the lamp. You eat a pie at midday from a woman who has a basket on Holborn, mutton and gravy, the pastry a little grey, but the filling hot enough that you don't mind. Mr. Cavendish dictates a letter to a client in Southwark, in a voice that suggests he has dictated this particular letter, or letters very like it, many hundreds of times. The afternoon light on Cursitor Street moves through its brief grey arc and then gives up. You go upstairs. You eat bread and a hard-cooked egg for supper. You sleep. Thursday morning is colder than Tuesday was. There has been a frost overnight. The mud on Cursitor Street has hardened into ridges and hollows that catch your feet oddly as you walk. The cold is almost violent this morning, the kind that makes your eyes water even in still air, and there is not still air. There's a wind coming from the north that finds every gap in your coat, the too wide shoulders, the place where the top button has been, replaced with one that doesn't quite match and never quite sits flat. You're walking to Addison's at 7:20 with your shoulders up around your ears, and you're thinking about the afternoon. Addison's in the morning is ordinary. It smells the same. Will is behind the counter with his appraising eyes. The usual morning complement of clerks and lawyers' men and the heavy-set man in the bad wig settle into their routines. Your coffee is hot. Your corner is free. The newspapers circulate. The man in the mud-coloured coat is not here. Of course he isn't. His afternoons are at Addison's, not his mornings. You drink your coffee. You read a page and a half of a newspaper without retaining anything. You look at the room, the way you always look at it, with the particular quality of looking that is not about seeing. That is about calibrating. There is a man at a table in the centre you haven't seen before. Youngish, your age maybe, neat clothes, a wig that fits properly. He's reading a pamphlet. He looks up once, briefly at nothing, and then back down. There is a man near the fire, older, who keeps clearing his throat in the small rhythmic way of someone who has a cold or anxiety or both. There is nothing unusual about this room at 7 in the morning on a Thursday. You finish your coffee, you go to work. At Cavendish's there are 2 wills to copy and a set of articles of apprenticeship for a glover on Cheapside. The wills are long, as wills are, with their intricate provisions and their careful hierarchies of who gets what should what happen when. You copy them in the clean neutral hand that is your professional self. The self that exists between 7 in the morning and however late the work requires. At 2:30, Mr. Cavendish tells you to take the afternoon. Some matter with a client has resolved itself early. You can go. You take your coat. You go. Addison's at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday is, as Edward said, a different room. It's not dramatically different. Not at first. It is still a coffeehouse. In a narrow building on Fleet Street. It still smells of coffee and pipe smoke and damp wool. Will is still behind the counter. The fire is still burning in the grate. But the morning's particular population is gone, and in its place is a different one. And the difference is in the texture of the room, in the quality of the attention in it, in the way men are sitting. In the morning, men sit to read or to conduct business. The posture is purposive, back slightly forward, eyes on paper. In the afternoon, some of these men are sitting differently. Not all of them, maybe a third of the people in the room, but those who sit with their backs against the wall, or turned slightly so they can see the door, and they are not reading, or they are reading with the quality you noticed in Edward, which is reading as a decoy rather than reading as an activity, and the room is talking, not at the level of the morning's occasional conversation. Clusters of 2 and 3 low-voiced, the particular sound of conversation that is not meant to travel. You stand for a moment just inside the door. Will appears at your elbow with remarkable speed. "Over there," he says, barely opening his mouth. He inclines his head so slightly it is almost not a gesture at all. "Mr. Finch came in 20 minutes ago. Then he's gone." You look at the table Will didn't quite point at. Edward Finch, still in his mud-coloured coat, is sitting with another man. The other man is perhaps 25, not tall, with brown hair and the particular ink-stained fingers of someone who works with pigment or dye. He's talking, low, and Edward is listening with his head tilted very slightly to the right. You walk over. Edward sees you coming. He doesn't smile, but his face changes in some way that functions as a smile. "Thomas," he says, "come and sit." The other man stops talking. He looks at you. His eyes are dark, very dark, and they have the quality of paying attention in a way that most eyes don't. A kind of focus that is present without being aggressive. He has a small scar at the corner of his mouth. Old, white, probably from a childhood fall. "James," Edward says, "this is Thomas Marsh. He works for Cavendish in Holborn." James looks at you for a moment. "Hello," he says. His voice is lighter than you expected. London-born, you think. Southwark, maybe. "Sit down." You sit down. Will brings coffee without being asked. This is the first time you have ever sat at a table in a coffee house and not been alone. The realization of this is very quiet and very large. What follows over the next 2 hours is, in terms of external events, extremely undramatic. 3 men drinking coffee at a corner table of a Fleet Street coffee house on a Thursday afternoon. This is not a rare occurrence in London. There is nothing from the outside that would mark this table as different from any other table in the room. What happens at the table is conversation. Edward asks you about your copying work. James asks about Bristol. You ask James what he paints. He works for a sign painter on the Strand mostly, doing the repetitive but technically demanding work of letters and decorative borders. On his own time he paints people, small portraits on commission from the kind of clients who want a portrait but can't afford an actual portrait. Clerks and shopkeepers and merchants' wives who want a likeness of someone they love. He names a sum he charges for one of these, and it is not much, but it's more than he spends because his needs are small, he says, and he says it in a way that makes you understand he means it. Edward talks about a book that came into the shop this week, a memoir by a traveller to the Ottoman Empire full of descriptions of a society organised along different lines than the English one. And he quotes a passage about the bathhouses, and James laughs, a quiet laugh, and you laugh, and the conversation moves on. At some point during this conversation, without it being announced or acknowledged, you understand that you are in a place you have been looking for. Not the physical place, or not only that, the feeling in the room, the quality of sitting at a table where no one needs you to be something other than what you are, where the things you haven't said out loud don't need to be said out loud because they are already understood, where the silence between sentences doesn't carry danger. You've been carrying, without knowing it, a permanent and very slightly elevated level of vigilance. The vigilance of someone who is always one sentence away from saying something wrong, who is always in the process of calculating how to be in the room without revealing the thing that would change the room. Here, right now, the calculation is suspended. It is extraordinary how much room that frees up inside you. James is talking about a sign he's painting for a tallow merchant in Cheapside. The merchant wants a candle on the sign, but has very particular views on the shape of the candle that are, James says, incompatible with the laws of perspective, and there has been extensive negotiation. As he describes this, his hands move, illustrating the geometry of the argument, and you watch his hands. The ink stains on the outside of his right hand's fingers, the way the index finger on his left hand has a slight permanent curve, an old break maybe, that gives his gestures a particular quality. You're watching his hands and you're also watching the room, the way you always watch the room. The two activities are running simultaneously, the old vigilance and the new ease side by side. The room, you observe, is also watching itself. There are rules here you're beginning to understand, not written ones. The unwritten ones are always the most thoroughly observed. You do not make excessive eye contact with people you don't know. You do not sit closer to another man than the furniture naturally requires. You do not touch. You do not speak above the conversational register. If someone unfamiliar comes in, the room's quality shifts slightly. a collective micro-adjustment, and it shifts back after the unfamiliar person has sat down somewhere unremarkable and done something unremarkable. If the unfamiliar person orders coffee and opens a newspaper and ignores the room gradually returns to itself. If the unfamiliar person looks at the room with the particular fixed attention of someone who is cataloguing rather than observing, the room changes in a different way. Conversations end or change subject. Men who are sitting together find reasons to move apart. A kind of practiced dissolution. This too you understand without being told. There is a word for the men who catalogue rooms. Informers. The Society for the Reformation of Manners employs them. The Society has been employing them for 30 years, its members committed to the purification of public morals, which in practice means the systematic prosecution of prostitutes and sodomites, and anyone else whose visible behaviour offends the particular vision of decency that the Society's members maintain. The Society employs men who go into taverns and coffeehouses and make note of what they see and report to the magistrates. The raids of 1726 were partly the result of informers. You know this because Edward told you about it in the bookshop on Tuesday. He told you in the same even, informational way he tells you everything, without drama. Because drama is a luxury you cannot afford with information like this. You need to be able to hear it clearly. There was a man named Samuel Stevens, who became the key informer against Margaret Clap's house. He attended the house regularly. He built relationships. He watched. He was patient. And then he testified, and 3 men hanged. The year is now 1730. Stevens is still operating. He's not the only one. The Society is active and funded, and its members believe with genuine conviction that they are doing God's work. You sit in Addison's on a Thursday afternoon and you drink your coffee and you talk to Edward and James about sign painting and Ottoman bathhouses and the price of paper, and you watch the room. This is what it costs, you think. This is the price of the table, the constant reading of the room. The vigilance you can suspend but never eliminate. The way you can lower your shoulders but they will come back up at the next sound. The way relaxation here is a practice rather than a state. Something you have to keep choosing. 3 men hanged. At Tyburn in the ordinary way in front of a crowd that came for the entertainment. The same crowd that had come for highway robbers and murderers. Their names were Gabriel Lawrence and William Griffin and Thomas Wright, and they were killed for loving men. And it was 4 years ago, and it might as well be yesterday from the way Edward's voice moves when he says the names. You think about this sitting at the table. James is saying something about the season, about how the light in February makes everything look like charcoal, which is fair but also boring. He'd rather work in summer. Edward is listening with the same slight tilt of his head. The fire crackles. Someone at another table laughs at something, a short laugh, immediately controlled. The afternoon is moving toward its end. The light through the low window is thickening. People are beginning to gather their things. Sunday morning, Edward says to both of you, if it's not raining, St. James's Park. He says it the way you'd say any arrangement. Sunday morning, St. James's Park, as if you're meeting to walk and take the air, which is exactly what it will look like from the outside. James nods. They both look at you. I'll be there, you say. On the way back to Cursitor Street in the dark and the cold, you realise you're walking differently. Not faster or slower, just differently. The city looks the same. Fleet Street, Chancery Lane, the familiar mud and cobblestone and the smells of an evening city winding down from its daily industry. The fishmonger 2 streets over whose smell you've been unable to avoid for 11 months. the tailor at the corner who works by candlelight late into the evening, his silhouette visible in the window. All of this is the same. But you are moving through it with something slightly different in your chest, something that has no clean name, something between relief and terror and the sensation you had as a child when you climbed to the top of a very tall tree and looked out over a landscape you'd never seen from that angle before. The simultaneous vertigo and exhilaration, the understanding that you cannot unsee it. Sunday morning, 3 days. Sunday morning at St. James's Park feels like a reasonable distance away. Far enough to be future, close enough to be real. You go upstairs, you take off your coat, you sit on your bed in the dark room above the printing press, and you try to be very quiet inside yourself, the way you sometimes have to be after a day that has been too much, too full, when the city has been more present than usual. Below you, the printing press is silent. After dark, it stops. The building settles into its own sounds, the creak of old wood, the distant street sounds filtering in. You're lying on your back looking at the ceiling. The crack in the plaster runs from the window to the corner. You have looked at it for 11 months. Tonight it is the same crack it has always been. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. You close your eyes. Sunday morning at St. James's Park will be cold. Cold enough that most people with choices will stay inside. The park in February has particular quality. The bare trees against a white sky, the path slightly slippery with frost, the birds that stay all winter moving through the pale light. There are, in St. James's Park, particular paths, particular benches, particular sequences of movement that have their own code, their own semaphore of position and pace and eye direction. The park has been, in this way, a territory of this hidden city for decades, perhaps longer. Men walk the paths and read the signals, and the world continues around them, oblivious, or at least performing obliviousness, which amounts to the same thing. Edward will show you this, or you'll learn it by watching him, which is probably how he learned it. The knowledge passes this way, person to person, without instruction manuals, without anything written down that could be found and used against you. You think about James's hands, the ink stains, the slight permanent curve of the broken finger. You think about the small scar at the corner of his mouth. You have not touched anyone since you left Bristol. This is not unusual. You are a copying clerk in a solicitor's office. Your world is professional and contained and mostly conducted at the distance of a desk. But there's a difference between the ordinary absence of touch and the touch you've been missing, and you are aware of that difference tonight in your narrow bed above the silent printing press, in a way you're almost never aware of it. You sleep. Saturday passes. You have no Tuesday arrangement, but Edward has told you his shop is open on Saturdays, and you go in around noon on some pretext about looking for a pamphlet on surveying, which is the same pretext you used the first time, and Edward accepts it with the same slightly not quite smile. Christoph is here, behind the counter with his remarkable arithmetic. He's perhaps 23, fair-haired, with the quality of a man who has organised the world into a very precise system, and is suspicious of anything that doesn't fit it. He looks at you when you come in and looks back at his ledger, and you understand that you are probably not a suspicious element in his ledger. Edward is at the back of the shop sorting through a box of recently acquired volumes. He looks up when you appear in the narrow doorway. "The park tomorrow," he says. 10 o'clock, the East Gate. "Right," you say. "Dress warmly," he says, which is the kind of practical advice that is very Edward, and you nod and look at a shelf, and he goes back to his books. You stay for 20 minutes. You buy a slim pamphlet on London's water supply for 3 pennies, which you were mildly interested in when you saw it. You leave. Sunday morning is bright. You didn't expect that. February in London and brightness feel like contradictory terms, but the overnight clouds have cleared and the sky is that particular winter blue, very pale, very clear, that happens maybe 6 times in a London winter, and the sun is low and strong and hitting the frost on every surface in a way that makes the city look briefly like something worth the effort. Your breath makes clouds as you walk south from Cursitor Street toward the park, down through Holborn and the Strand and the increasingly clean architecture of the western streets, where the buildings are newer and the roads better maintained and the people on them dressed at a level, suggesting they own several coats and have options about which to wear. St. James's Park in February. The paths are still partly frosted in the shade. The grass is stiff and pale, the trees are bare, and the pond at the centre of the park has a thin skin of ice along its north edge, where the sun doesn't reach until midday. There are, despite the cold, a moderate number of people here. Sunday mornings in the park are a tradition. Ladies and gentlemen take the air. Servants walk dogs belonging to their employers. Children are brought by their nurses to run briefly and then be brought back inside. There are street vendors near the gate selling hot drinks, a woman with a brazier and a pot, and you stop and buy something from her that is either very bad coffee or very good burnt water, and hold the cup in both hands for the warmth. You find the East Gate. You stand near it with your hot drink and wait. Edward arrives at 10:03. He is wearing a heavier coat today, dark blue wool that fits him properly, and a hat pulled low. He looks like a man who has come to take the Sunday air, which is exactly what he is, and also not what he is. "Good morning," he says. "Morning, you say." James arrives 4 minutes later. He's slightly out of breath, as if he's been walking fast and his cheeks are red from the cold. He's wearing a coat that's a better colour than Edward's, a kind of deep green, slightly faded but clean, and he has a scarf wound around his neck that looks handmade. He raises a hand in greeting and his breath makes a cloud. The 3 of you fall into step together along the main path heading west. This is normal. 3 men walking in the park on a Sunday morning. This happens constantly. You walk. Edward talks about a letter he received this week from a bookseller in Edinburgh, about a collection of manuscripts that might be worth acquiring. James says something about the light this morning and how it would be good to paint in, if he had a subject. You talk about the conveyance you copied on Friday, which involved a property dispute of such long-standing complexity that it had apparently been through 3 generations of lawyers already. You talk about ordinary things, and as you do, you notice the park, not the trees or the ice or the sky, the people in it. There are, on this Sunday morning in St. James's Park, a number of men who are walking in a particular way, not with the purposive stride of exercise or the ambling pace of leisure, a middle pace, measured, with a quality of attention directed sideways rather than forward. They are spread out across the paths in 1s and 2s, and they move at angles that seem random and are not, small circuits and deflections, and occasionally 2 of these men will converge on the same bench and sit for a few minutes and then separate again. "Don't stare," Edward says quietly beside you. He hasn't looked at you. He's watching the middle distance. I'm not. You're doing very well for someone who's seeing this for the first time. James makes a sound that is a suppressed laugh. "The important thing," Edward says, still in the same low voice, "is that you are always 3 things: unremarkable, specific, and ready to become unremarkable immediately." What does that mean? It means you look like you're doing exactly what you appear to be doing, until you need to look like you're doing something else, at which point you do it without ceremony and without anything that could be read as guilt. Guilt being the most legible thing in a crowd. Exactly. Edward nods slightly. Guilt is visible from a remarkable distance. You walk. A man is sitting on a bench ahead of you, reading a newspaper. He's perhaps 40, well dressed, with the quality of a city merchant or a professional man. He looks up from the newspaper as you pass, not at all of you, not at Edward, but briefly, for a fraction of a second, at James. Then he's reading his newspaper again. James doesn't look at the man on the bench, but his pace changes by perhaps half a step, barely perceptible. You file this away. That man, you say. Which man? Edward says. The one reading the newspaper. A brief pause. That's Mr. Harwood. He's a chandler's factor in Bishopsgate. He's perfectly safe. You think about your father, who's a chandler in Bristol, and then you don't think about that. The path curves around the south side of the pond. The ice along the north edge catches the low sunlight and throws it back, a strip of brightness in the pale morning. A duck moves across the unfrozen water in the centre, with the determined indifference of ducks. How long have you known the park, you ask? You're asking Edward, but you're aware of James slightly to your right, and this feels specific somehow. The question existing in the space between both of them. 12 years, Edward says. I grew up in it, James says. Practically. My mother's sister lives on the street to the north, and when I was small she used to bring me here. I knew the park for years before I knew what it was. A pause. He looks at the pond. There's something I like about that, he says. It's the same park, the same paths, the same birds. Only what you see in it changes. He looks at you sideways for a moment. Just a moment. You see it differently now than you did 11 months ago, he says. I've never been here before, you say. I mean the city, James says. All of it. He's right. You nod. The three of you walk for an hour. The morning moves around you with its cold, pale brightness. At one point, Edward stops at a bench and talks to a man you don't know, briefly, about something to do with a printing matter, and you and James continue a circuit ahead and come back, and during those 10 minutes you and James are walking side by side and alone. James is from Southwark, as you suspected. His father was a waterman who worked the Thames. He learned to paint from an uncle who did church work, decorative painting, the gilded frames and cherubs and so on of Georgian ecclesiastical decoration. He has 3 sisters and 1 brother. He shares rooms with another man on Aldgate, a printer named Robert, who is, he says with a slight pause that you understand, one of us. One of us. The phrase is so plain, such a quiet capsule of everything unsayable. How long have you known, you ask? By which you mean how long have you known about yourself, and he understands this immediately. Since I was 14, he says. I was walking across Southwark Bridge and a man going the other direction smiled at me and I understood something about myself that I'd been not quite understanding for at least 2 years. What happened? Nothing. He walked on. I walked on. I stood on the bridge for 10 minutes looking at the river. He pauses. Then I went home and had supper. You laugh. It comes out slightly surprised, the laugh. James smiles. The scar at the corner of his mouth moves. What about you? He says. 15, you say. Bristol. It was a lot less dramatic, just waking up one morning and knowing. The knowing is always the same, James says. Like waking up. Like you've been slightly asleep for years and then you're not. He looks at the path ahead. A bird is crossing it. A robin, deliberate and small. The part after the knowing is different for everyone, he says. Edward rejoins you. The rest of the morning passes in walking and talking, and the particular pleasure of being 3 people in a space together. When the church bells begin to mark 11 o'clock, you separate at the east gate with the undemonstrative ease of people who will see each other again soon. Edward says Thursday. James says Thursday. You say Thursday. And then you walk back to Cursitor Street through the brilliant February morning, and the city around you is both familiar and entirely different. And you keep hearing James say one of us in the plainest possible voice, without shame or lowering, as if it were the most ordinary information in the world, which perhaps it is, which perhaps it should be, which it is not. You need to understand what the city around you is right now in 1730 in the matter of the thing you are. This is the city of the Society for the Reformation of Manners, which has prosecuted over 90,000 people in the past 40 years for moral offences of various kinds. 90,000! Most of them prostitutes or drunkards, but not all. The society employs informers who attend specifically to catch sodomites, and their work is thorough and dedicated and driven by a genuine conviction that they are protecting England from divine punishment. The Great Fire of 1666 is still in living memory. The Plague of 1665 is still in living memory. These things happened. God is watching. The men of the society believe this down to their boots. This is the city where in 1726 a woman named Margaret Clap watched 3 men she knew hang at Tyburn for crimes that took place in her house, and where she herself was sentenced to stand in the pillory and sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, and where she stood in the pillory in Smithfield while the crowd threw what crowds throw at people in pillories, which is everything they can reach. This is the city where the legal instrument under which all of this proceeds is the Buggery Act, passed in 1533 under Henry VIII, which prescribes death, not prison, death. The word sodomy in a court document is a different word in 1730 than it is in other centuries. It is a word that means the gallows are possible. The word carries that weight in every syllable. And this is also the city in which men like Edward Finch run bookshops on Fleet Street, and men like James paint signs on the Strand, and they meet on Thursday afternoons at Addison's and Sunday mornings in St. James's Park, and they live their lives carefully, with the full weight of the Buggery Act and the Society for the Reformation of Manners, and the memory of 1726 pressing on them at all times, in all spaces, in every conversation. This is what courage looks like in 1730, not a dramatic act, a Thursday afternoon, a Sunday morning, getting up and going to work and being extremely careful about where you look and for how long, and still, despite all of it, still finding the room, still finding the table, still saying one of us out loud in a park to a man you've just met. The weeks that follow have a new texture. Your mornings at Addison's are the same mornings they always were, in the same grey cold, with the same coffee and Will's same appraising eyes. But something in the room has shifted for you, or something in you that perceives the room has shifted, and now when you sit in your corner you see it more completely. The morning population is the morning population, but occasionally now you see a face that you'll see again on Thursday afternoon, at a different table, in a different register. There's a man you learn is named Philip, a journeyman printer, who comes in Tuesday and Thursday mornings and always sits near the door and always folds his newspaper in exactly the same way. In the mornings he is barely noticeable, a medium-sized man in medium-quality clothes doing medium-level work. On Thursday afternoons you discover he has a laugh like a barrel falling downstairs, enormous and genuine, and he knows the dirtiest jokes in any room and delivers them with the particular timing of someone who has had a lot of practice, making people laugh in situations where laughter is a controlled risk. There's a man named George who sells paper from a cart on Fetter Lane, who is there on Thursday afternoon sometimes, and who has an obvious and poorly concealed attachment to Philip that manifests as the most elaborate false indifference you have ever witnessed. Every time Philip makes one of his enormous laughs, George looks at the ceiling or the wall or his coffee cup with an expression of heroic unconcern that fools nobody in the room, and Philip, who notices this, angles his next joke to produce the biggest possible laugh, and so on. There's an older man, maybe 60, with white hair and an excellent wig, who sits at a table slightly separate from the rest, and reads with genuine absorption, and occasionally looks up and says something extremely precise and quietly devastating about whatever is being discussed, and whose name Edward tells you is Bertram, and who has been coming to this particular table since before Edward himself arrived in London. These are the people of the afternoon room. You learn their textures gradually, the way you learn any new geography, by moving through it until it becomes familiar. And through it all, every Thursday and some Sunday mornings, and 2 or 3 accidental crossings on the Strand when you're running an errand and James is walking back from somewhere, and you've begun to recognise the green coat at a distance. Through all of it, James, who talks about painting the way other people talk about breathing as the fundamental medium of his existence. James, who has strong and specific opinions about colours and will, without warning, produce a small argument for why a particular shade of ochre is undervalued in the current fashion, delivered with the seriousness of someone making a legal case. James, who is bad at estimating distances, and who therefore always arrives slightly late because he assumed the walk would take less time than it did. James, whose hands are always slightly stained and who smells very faintly of linseed oil, a smell you have now come to associate with Thursdays and Sunday mornings, and the weight of something you still don't quite have a name for. In March, on a Sunday, it rains. The park is not an option in the rain, or not the kind of rain this is, which is serious rain, cold and determined, the kind that soaks through wool in minutes. Edward sends word to James. James sends word to you through the remarkable efficiency of the city's informal communication, which turns out to involve Will at Addison's as a central node. And instead of the park, the 3 of you meet at Edward's bookshop, which is open because Edward is always open. The shop is warm. Christoph is not there on Sundays. Edward has a fire going and a pot of something on the small stove in the back room, which turns out to be a soup of some kind with root vegetables and salt pork, excellent and hot. The 3 of you eat soup in the back room of the bookshop while the rain works seriously against the windows and talk. You talk about things you haven't talked about before, because the park doesn't have that kind of time or that kind of walls. James talks about the first man he ever loved. His name was Daniel. He was a chandler's apprentice in Suffolk. They were both 17, and nothing exactly happened between them except that James knew, absolutely knew, what the thing between them was, and Daniel either didn't know or knew and was more frightened than James, and then Daniel moved to Norwich with his master's household, and that was the end of it. He says this simply. He says the name, Daniel. He doesn't perform any particular emotion around it. It was what it was, he says. It was 17. Edward talks about a man named George, whom he has mentioned before. George lost the use of his writing hand in the Smithfield pillory in 1726. He still has both hands physically, but the tremor in the right one means he cannot write well or draw well, and writing and drawing were how he lived. He works now at a counting house, doing verbal auditing work that his employer values because George is very precise with numbers and very reliable. He is all right, Edward says. He is alive. He is doing what he can with what he has. Edward says this with the evenness. He says everything, but there is something underneath it, a particular quality of contained long-term grief that you recognise from the way your mother used to talk about a brother she lost when she was young. Not dramatic, not performed, just present. You tell them about Bristol. You tell them about reading the newspaper in 1726 at 17, and the fire. You tell them about the 11 months in London, the early morning walk to Addison's every day, the corner table, the way you watch the room without knowing what you were watching for. You knew what you were watching for, James says, not unkindly, as a correction of record. I didn't have words for it, you say. You knew, he says. You look at him across the small table with the soup bowls and the candle, and the rain against the window. Yes, you say, I knew. There's a moment of particular stillness. Outside, the rain is a London rain, determined and impersonal, falling on the Fleet Street bookshops and the Chancery Lane solicitors, and the river and the park and the Smithfield pillory, and the Tyburn gallows and everything else equally, without preference, without judgment. Inside, in a warm room above a shop full of books, a man who paints signs and a man who sells books and a man who copies documents are eating soup and saying true things out loud. It costs nothing in this moment. This is the luxury that the ordinary world takes for granted and that this world grants only in certain rooms, at certain times, after certain negotiations with certain specific risks. The luxury of being truthful about the contents of your own chest. James reaches across the table and touches the back of your hand for a moment. His fingers are warm from the soup bowl. Then he takes them back. Right, he says. Who wants more soup? You want more soup. Edward wants more soup. James ladles it out. The rain continues. You need to understand the Society for the Reformation of Manners more specifically, because a society is not an abstraction. It is a system, and the system has teeth. And in March of 1730 those teeth are very close. The society was founded in 1691, and has prosecuted, as mentioned, nearly 100,000 people. It publishes annual reports detailing its work, lists of arrests and prosecutions, printed in a pious and satisfied tone that makes its violence legible as benevolence. Its membership includes men of considerable standing, merchants and clergy and city officials who believe genuinely and with scriptural support that the moral condition of England is a matter of national survival. The members of the society are not stupid. The intelligence that built and funded and sustained it for 40 years is real, and the informers it employs are real, patient, trained to be present without being noticed, to build trust before they act. In the spring of 1730 there is a man who comes to Addison's on Tuesday afternoons. You notice him because he doesn't fit the texture of the room. This is a feeling before it's a thought. The same way the temperature of a room registers before your brain has formed a sentence about it. He is perhaps 30, unremarkable in appearance, pleasant manner, no excess of attention. He nurses a single cup of coffee for 2 hours. He doesn't talk to anyone. He comes 3 Tuesdays in a row. The 4th Tuesday he is not there. The 5th Tuesday he is there again. You tell Edward. You tell him between customers in the bookshop, in the brief low-voiced way you've learned to share information that matters. You tell him what you saw, specifically, the Tuesday pattern, the long single cup, the quality of attention. Edward is quiet for a moment. What day does he sit, he says. Different tables, never the same twice. Does he watch individuals or watch the room? Room, you say. Always room. You're sure? I've watched him watching. His eyes move differently from ours, less stopping. Edward nods. He's thinking. I'll talk to Will, he says. Will, when consulted, remembers the man. His name, he's given it as Brown, which is either a real name or the most obvious false one available. He's paid in pennies. He comes at 2:30 and leaves at 4:30. Will has noted that Mr. Brown appears once a week, but not always on the same day of the week, which is the pattern of someone varying their schedule to seem less patterned. Have you seen anyone like this before? You ask Will. Will looks at you with his appraising eyes. 3 times, he says. Before, in other years. What happened? 2 times, nothing. Whoever it was stopped coming. A pause. The 3rd time, Will says, was 1726. He goes back to the counter. You carry this information back to Edward. Edward carries it to the people who need to know it. The Thursday afternoon room shifts, very slightly, the way it shifts when someone unfamiliar comes in. Except, this time it doesn't shift back. It settles at a slightly different level, a different calibration. The Thursday afternoons continue, but they are more careful. The conversations are more oblique. Men who are sitting together begin sometimes to sit separately and talk across the room in the public way that anyone might talk, about the newspapers, about the weather, about commodity prices, about nothing at all that has any content. Philip's enormous laughs are less frequent. George's elaborate false indifference is turned down slightly. Even Bertram, in his excellent wig, is reading his book with a more genuinely absorbed quality, less available for the occasional devastating remark. The room is protecting itself. You watch Mr. Brown on a Tuesday afternoon in April. He comes in at his usual time and sits at a different table than usual, near the window. He orders his coffee. He opens a pamphlet. He reads it. Or he appears to read it. His eyes, as you've established, move differently from a reader's eyes. A reader's eyes slow down and stop and speed up according to the difficulty of the text, the interesting or dull passages, the paragraphs that need rereading. Mr. Brown's eyes maintain a steady pace, the pacing of someone who is not reading. You're watching him very carefully while appearing to read a newspaper. At 4:10, a man you don't know comes in and sits 2 tables from Mr. Brown. He's perhaps 25, well-dressed, in a wig that fits. He orders coffee. He looks at the room with the same not-quite-right quality that Mr. Brown has. 2 of them. Your stomach drops slightly. You don't move. You continue reading your newspaper. Your hand, holding the paper, is very steady. You're aware of it being steady in the way you're aware of things you're controlling. Nothing happens. Both men drink their coffee. Neither approaches anyone. Neither speaks to anyone except Will. They leave within 10 minutes of each other, not together, through the same door. You sit in your corner until the room has returned to something like normal. Then you pay and leave and walk directly to the bookshop. Edward listens. He's very still when he listens to things like this. 2, he says when you've finished. 2, you confirm. He's quiet for a moment. The pattern in 1726, he says, before the raid on Field Lane, was approximately 3 months of observation. They're patient. They build a case. They want multiple names. not just a single arrest. He looks at you. Thursday afternoons at Addison's need to stop, he says, for a while. The loss of this is very specific. You feel it locate itself in your chest, a small distinct weight. How long, you say? Until I can determine whether they're building something or fishing. He pauses. These things sometimes blow over. The society has limited resources and many targets, and sometimes an informer is simply gathering information for a report that never goes anywhere. And sometimes it does go somewhere, you say. Yes, he says. Sometimes it does. He looks at the books on the shelves around him. The accumulated weight of other people's knowledge and thought, 2 walls of it floor to ceiling. I'll send word through Will, he says. For now, individually, the shop, the park, smaller groups. James, you say. He knows already. I sent Christoph to his rooms this morning, you nod. Thomas, Edward says. He's using your name in the way he uses it when he wants you to hear the thing he's actually saying. You look at him. You did the right thing, seeing it, telling me. A lot of people wouldn't have seen it. A lot of people aren't from Bristol, you say, which doesn't quite make sense as a sentence, but he understands it. He almost smiles. Get home, he says. Come to the shop on Saturday. James will be here. The weeks that follow are a different kind of careful. You still go to Addison's in the morning because not going would be more conspicuous than going. But you go in the morning only, and you drink your coffee and read your newspaper, and you don't stay. You look for Mr. Brown, and sometimes he is there and sometimes he isn't. The Thursday afternoons at Cavendish's pass in their usual rhythm. The wills and conveyances and depositions accumulate. You copy them. You warm your fingers against the lamp. The spring comes on grudgingly, the way spring comes in London. A week of warmth followed by a week of cold, back and forth, a negotiation. On Saturdays you go to the bookshop. This is different from the Thursday afternoons at Addison's, which were a room of many people. The bookshop on Saturdays is 2 or 3 people, maximum. You and James, usually. Sometimes Edward. Sometimes a man named Francis, who designs architectural drawings and has a particular friendship with Edward that is not explained to you and doesn't need to be. In the bookshop on Saturdays you talk. You read things Edward recommends. You look at the books the way you look at streets. You know well, finding the same ones in their same places with the same pleasure. And James is there. James, on a Saturday in May, is working in one corner of the bookshop on a small painting. He's asked Edward if he can use the corner for this purpose, and Edward, who has arranged a good north light there from the upper window, has said yes. So James sits in the north light corner on Saturday afternoons with a small wooden board and his pigments and his linseed oil, and he works. You sit across the room from him and pretend to read. What you are doing is watching his hands, the brush moving in small deliberate strokes, the checking, stepping back slightly, tilting the head, the return, the small correction, then the stepping back again. He is painting a portrait, small, on a piece of panel perhaps 8 inches square. A man's face, someone you don't know. Brown coat, a thoughtful expression. Commission, you say. A woman on Cornhill wants a likeness of her husband for the anniversary of their marriage, James says. He looks at the panel. He couldn't sit. Too busy. She gave me a description and a sketch she made herself. He looks at the panel with the assessment of someone measuring a distance. The sketch was not good. What does he look like? Like a man, James says. More specifically, like a man who is pleased with himself but not in a way he'd want recorded. He picks up a brush. I'm making him slightly more dignified than she described. A service, you say. A significant artistic liberty, he says, and you hear the joke in it. the precision. The afternoon passes. The light in the north window moves slowly. The smell of linseed oil adds itself to the room's usual smells, books and paper, and it becomes the smell of a Saturday in May in a bookshop on Fleet Street, specific and unrepeatable, the kind of afternoon that settles into your memory as a whole sensory unit. At some point Edward makes tea. He makes it in the back room with a small stove, and it's good strong tea, and he brings it out on a wooden tray with a chipped cup for each of you, and you all sit and drink it in the particular comfortable quiet of people who don't need to fill a silence. James says, without looking up from the portrait, "There was a coffee house on Lombard Street that I used to go to before Addison's, run by a man named Tate. Very small, very dark. You could hardly see who you were sitting next to. He's been closed since last year." He pauses, adds a line. "I heard the society got to someone who knew Tate. Not Tate himself. Someone downstream." The quiet in the room shifts slightly. "Is he all right?" you say. "He's in Bristol," James says. The smallest pause. "Also I heard." In Bristol. The word lands with a particular weight in your chest, given that you're from Bristol, and Bristol is where people go when London gets too dangerous. "He had a shop here for 11 years, James says. Very small. Very dark." He looks at the portrait he's painting. "I liked it." Edward says nothing. He's looking at the middle distance in the way he looks at things when he's thinking. "The society isn't going away," he says eventually. "It's been 40 years. It will be another 40 years. We don't get to wait it out." A pause. "What we get," he says, "is this. This is what we get. What we make with what we have." He gestures at the room, the books on the shelves, the tea, the portrait taking shape on James's panel, you in your chair with your half-read book. "This is not nothing," he says. He picks up his tea. "This is not nothing at all," he says. You drink your tea. Outside on Fleet Street a cart passes. The sound of it comes in through the window, wood and iron and the hooves of the horse, the ordinary mechanical music of the city going about its afternoon. You are warm. Your fingers are unstiff for the first time today, the tea having dealt with the last of the spring cold that hasn't quite given up yet. The book in your lap is a history of Rome that Edward told you to read, and that you're finding more interesting than you expected. The smell of linseed oil sits in the room pleasantly. James's brush moves. It is not nothing. You're beginning, slowly, and against the habitual resistance of someone who'd been careful for a long time, to believe that. The summer comes. London in summer is what London in winter was, but at the opposite extreme, and also somehow the same mud just hotter, the same crowds just slower, the same river just more pungent. The Fleet Ditch, which runs south from Holborn through the city to the Thames, achieves in summer a smell that is almost metaphysical in its completeness. A smell that exists at a level of thoroughness that suggests it has always existed and always will, that it is less a smell than a fact of London, as certain as the river itself. You learn, as all London learns, to breathe shallowly on certain streets at certain times of day, to be selective about which air you let fully into your lungs. The park in summer is different from the park in February. The trees are full. The grass is green. There are flowers in the formal beds near the canal. The paths are busier. The Sunday morning walks more populated. And this means that the men who use the park in the specific way that Edward uses it in February are more diluted into a general population. And this is both safer and lonelier. You and James walk the South Path one Sunday in June when the morning is warm enough to be pleasant, and the light is doing what James said it would do in good weather, which is making everything look possible. You've been here 5 months now. This new version of here. The version with Edward and James and the bookshop on Saturdays. 5 months is longer than you've ever held anything steady in London. James is talking about a job he's declined. A commission for a series of painted panels for a house in Bloomsbury. Large, decorative, the kind of thing that would have paid well but required 6 months of work in a house where he'd be, he says, too visible. He declines work that makes him too visible in places where his being what he is might matter. You ask him how often he thinks about it. What, he says. Being visible, you say. Being careful. The cost of it. He's quiet for a moment. You're walking and his steps are slightly uneven the way they always are. His left leg a shade shorter than his right from an old break. Barely noticeable, but there. Every day, he says, not dramatically, just stating a fact. Not all day, but every day. Does it ever get less? Different, he says. It gets different. When you're new to it, every room is a calculation. Over time, the calculation becomes faster. You don't have to do it consciously anymore, but it doesn't stop. He looks at the path ahead. The thing I had to learn, he says, was that the cost and the life are the same thing. They're not two different things. You don't pay a cost and then get a life. The cost is part of the life. You think about this. I spent 2 years thinking, he says, that if I was just careful enough, if I was just small enough, I could live normally, and the thing I was would be a sort of private fact that didn't touch anything else, as if you can keep yourself separate from yourself. He pauses. Then I found Addison's on a Thursday afternoon. You look at him. He's looking at the path. What I mean, he says, is that the room at Addison's doesn't fix the calculation. It's just the calculation done differently. But differently matters. Differently is the difference between a room where you're always just about to leave and a room where you're actually there. He stops walking. You stop. He looks at you directly, which he doesn't often do. James, whose attention is usually slightly oblique, angled rather than direct, as if directness is a territory he enters carefully. You being at the table, he says, on Thursdays, in the bookshop, in the park. He stops. I'm saying it's not nothing, he says. What you said, what Edward said, but I mean it specifically about you, about the fact of you being there. Your heart is doing the unusual thing it has been doing with increasing frequency over the past 5 months. You have gotten, if not used to it, at least more familiar with it. The way you get familiar with the city you're learning, not comfortable exactly, but less lost. James, you say. Don't say anything careful, he says. I was going to say that the fact of you being there too, you say, is the same. The park moves around you. The Sunday morning people, the dogs on leads, the nurse with the children, a man on horseback in the distance, a bird singing something complicated in a tree you can't identify. James looks at you for a moment. Then he nods, as if something has been confirmed that he already knew. Right, he says. Walk. You walk. This is not, you should know, the end of the story in terms of difficulty. The world in which you're living doesn't become safe because 2 men in St. James's Park on a Sunday morning have said true things to each other. The Buggery Act is still in force. The Society for the Reformation of Manners is still operating. Mr. Brown, or whoever Mr. Brown is reporting to, is still appearing at Addison's on irregular Tuesdays, still nursing a single cup of coffee for too long, still watching the room in the steady, sweeping way that doesn't belong to a reader. The story of the autumn and the following winter is not a story of crisis, or not a crisis that falls directly on you. but it is the story of close proximity to crisis, which is the continuous texture of this life. You live inside that texture. You learn its specific weight. In September, a man named Isaac, who is a glazier and who comes sometimes to Addison's on Thursdays and sometimes to the bookshop on Saturdays, is arrested. Not at Addison's, not for anything connected to the room there. He's arrested in a court off Holborn for an offence that the constable observes directly, which is the most dangerous kind of arrest, the one that doesn't give you warning. He spends 3 nights in Newgate. He's brought before a magistrate. The charge against him is an attempt at sodomy, which is different from the completed act in the eyes of the law only in terms of sentencing. He's sentenced to the pillory and 6 months in prison. You hear this from Edward, who hears it from someone who is at the magistrate's hearing. The word moves through the network in the way all its words move, from person to person, quietly, in rooms. Isaac stands in the pillory on a Tuesday morning in October. You are at Cavendish's. You copy documents. Your hand moves steadily across the page and you think about Isaac, who is at this moment in Holborn, in the pillory, in October weather. You don't know what October crowds are like at a pillory. You know what they're like in general. You know about Smithfield in 1726. You don't go. There's nothing you could do there. Going would make you visible in a way that visibility means something. But you think about him every minute of that Tuesday. In the evening, Edward sends word. Isaac survived. He's bruised. He's shaken. But the crowd at Holborn was not as bad as Smithfield in 1726. He'll be in prison until spring. The network arranges small things. Some food for Isaac's household, which is him alone in his rooms above the glazier's shop. No family, just the work and the rooms. Someone will watch the shop, someone will pay the rent if it comes to it. This is what the network does. It watches and it moves information, and it arranges the small practical things that keep people alive when the system turns its attention to them. You contribute 2 shillings, which is not a large sum but is a genuine one. You give them to Will, who is a node in the network's practical operations in ways you're still learning to map. Will takes the 2 shillings with the same mild efficiency with which he takes everything, and you drink your morning coffee, and the city continues its morning business outside the window, and you think about what it costs and what it gives. The winter that year is very cold, colder than the previous one. The river freezes in December and a frost fair is talked about. The last one was 12 years ago, and this year it might happen, people say. And you think about what Edward told you about frost fairs. The strange holiday atmosphere of them, the stalls on the ice, the bonfires, the printing presses that are brought out and make commemorative certificates. But the river doesn't freeze solid this year. It gets close. There are ice flows and the watermen complain, but not solid. The winter passes. January. The cold that you know from experience now is February cold, the serious kind. The kind that was there when you arrived in London and has been part of every year since. You've been in London for 2 years now. You're 23 years old. Your handwriting, which was already good when you arrived, has become excellent. Mr. Cavendish has raised your wages by 4 shillings a year, which is not grand but is an acknowledgement. He's given you more complex work, not just copying, some drafting of letters and a little basic conveyancing preparation under his supervision. You have new gloves, not second-hand. Your own, bought new from a glover on the Strand, plain leather, close-fitting, warm enough for the work of a London winter. You bought them in November, and they still feel slightly too new, too good, the leather not yet worn to the exact shape of your hands. You are, by the measures available to you, making your way. Thursdays have returned to Addison's. The autumn's caution has passed without becoming a raid. Mr. Brown stopped appearing in October, around the time of Isaac's arrest, which suggests either that Isaac was his primary target, or that the Society's attention moved elsewhere, or both. The room has settled back toward itself, gradually, the way it always settles, the collective sigh of a held breath let out. Philip is back with his enormous laughs. George is back with his elaborate indifference. Bertram, in his excellent wig, is reading and occasionally devastating. The particular warmth of the room on a Thursday afternoon, which you now understand has no analogue anywhere else in your life, is there again the warmth of being in a room where something true can be said, where the calculation doesn't stop but is shared. You and James. This requires some careful accounting. What exists between you and James exists in the specific conditions of its world, which is to say it exists carefully, in rooms, at the level of what can be sustained without becoming visible. It is not what it would be in a different world, but it is not nothing. It is, to use a word Edward used once about something else, particular. It has its own specific shape, its own texture, its own satisfactions and its own precise frustrations. On a Saturday in November, in the bookshop, with Christoph away and Edward at a bookseller's auction in the Strand, you and James are alone in the shop. James is painting in his north light corner. You are reading, genuinely reading this time, a travel narrative about the Levant. The afternoon is quiet. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, James puts down his brush and looks at you. "Come and see this," he says. You go and stand next to him. The painting is of the corner of a room, just a corner, unremarkable, a wall and a floor. But the light is extraordinary. The light that comes in at an angle through a window you can just see the edge of, falling across the floor in a way that makes the floor itself seem significant, important. The grain of the wood, the edge of shadow. "That's here," you say. "That corner," he says, pointing at the actual corner of the actual room, which has the same light in it right now, the afternoon coming in from the north window. You look at the corner, then at the painting. He's made it true, and also made it more true than it is, the way good paintings do, the way they see the thing and give it back to you, having understood something about it that you didn't see before you looked at the painting. "It's very good," you say. He looks at it with his assessing look, the slight tilt, the back and forth. "The shadow is better than I thought it would be," he says. You're standing very close to him, the way you have to be to both stand in front of the painting and see it properly. You can smell the linseed oil and the pigment, and underneath that a smell that is specific to James, wool and something slightly warm, the smell of a person rather than a thing. He looks at you. Not with the oblique angle, the slightly averted quality of his usual gaze, directly. The afternoon in the bookshop is very quiet. The fire crackles. From Fleet Street comes the muffled sound of the city's constant transaction, distant enough to be atmospheric rather than present. You hold his gaze. The distance between you is the distance of two people standing in front of a small painting in a narrow corner of a bookshop. Not very much. He reaches up and puts his hand against the side of your face. His fingers are warm. The brush callus on his index finger catches slightly on your jaw. You put your hand over his hand. That's it. That's the entirety of what happens in the physical world in a bookshop on Fleet Street on a November Saturday afternoon with Christoph at an auction and Edward at the Strand. That's not nothing. That is, in fact, in the specific language of this world and its specific conditions, an enormous thing. You stand there for a moment, his hand on your face and yours over his, in the corner of a room that James has painted with its light. Then he lowers his hand and you lower yours. "Edward will be back by 5, James says. "Yes," you say. He goes back to his corner. You go back to your chair. You pick up your book about the Levant. He picks up his brush. The afternoon continues. You do not read a single word of the Levant for the remainder of the afternoon. This is not the story that ends with revelation or resolution. That is not how this world works, and you know how this world works now, which is one of the things you have learned in 2 years of learning it. This is the story of a life conducted in the conditions available to it. It is the story of Edward Finch's bookshop, and Addison's coffeehouse, and St. James's Park in the various weathers of various seasons, and of a room on Thursday afternoons where men who are not permitted to be themselves in public are, briefly, themselves. It is the story of Will behind the counter with his appraising eyes that see everything, and of Philip's enormous laughs, and of Bertram in his excellent wig being occasionally devastating about everything. It is the story of Isaac in Newgate for a winter, and of the network that kept his shop and paid his rent, and of the 2 shillings you put in Will's hand without ceremony, because that was what you had and what the situation needed. It is the story of James's hands, the ink stain, the broken finger, the brush callus on his index finger that catches slightly on your jaw. These are the materials of this life. These are the things it's made of. You lie in your bed above the printing press on a Thursday night in February, 2 years and 2 months after you arrived in London with your letter of introduction and your bag of clothes and your careful knowledge of something that had no name. You've given it names now, in your own head, where names can exist without consequences. You've heard other names for it, the names the newspapers used in 1726, the names the court used, the names the society uses in its annual reports. You don't use any of those names. You have your own. The printing press below is silent. You've stopped hearing it as an intrusion. It is simply part of the texture of the building's night heartbeat, resuming in the morning. You are warm. The fire you built this evening has done its job, and the room holds enough heat to be comfortable, which it doesn't always. Your gloves are on the table, new leather still slightly stiffer than you want. Your coat, the new one you bought in October with part of the wage increase, hangs on the hook by the door. The shoulders fit properly. Outside, London continues. The church bells will mark another hour soon. St. Andrew's first, then the others. The sequence of them, which you couldn't have predicted when you arrived and now could play from memory, the order and timing and quality of sound of the bells of the churches between Cursitor Street and Fleet Street. You know this city, not all of it. You will never know all of it. It is too large and too layered and too full of things you haven't seen yet and people you haven't met. But you know this part of it. The particular corridors and courts and shops and shortcuts between Cursitor Street and Addison's and Edward's bookshop and the east gate of St. James's Park. You know which turnings to take. You know which mud is ankle deep. You know the room at Addison's on a Thursday afternoon. This is a specific and irreplaceable piece of knowledge, not transferable, not learnable from a book. It lives in your body now, in the calibrated watch, the adjusted pace, the way your shoulders have learned to drop at a certain threshold of a certain door. Tomorrow is Friday, then Saturday, which is bookshop. James will be there. The painting of the corner is finished now. small and extraordinary, sitting in the corner of the bookshop in its north light. Edward has put it against the wall below the shelf where it can be seen if you know to look. You close your eyes. The city does what it does at night. The sounds settle into layers, the near ones and the middle distance ones and the far ones, the clock, the dog, the cart on a distant street, the voices from the tavern that carries its sounds to you, across some combination of yards and lanes that you've mapped in sound, if not in geography. These sounds are the city's breathing. You've been listening to them for 2 years. You know them the way you know the crack in the plaster, which is to say completely, and without need of explanation. You think about what Edward said in the bookshop last May, holding his tea. This is not nothing. What he meant was the room, the afternoon, the tea, James in the north-light corner, you in the chair, the books on the walls and the fire in the grate and the rain on the windows, these small, careful, particular things. He was right. Not nothing at all. Centuries from now, the buildings on this street will be different. Fleet Street will be different. London will be different. Larger and louder and brighter and different in ways that are not yet imaginable. The coffee house called Addison's will be something else, will have been something else, and then something else again, the walls rebuilt around different purposes. The Society for the Reformation of Manners will have dissolved gradually into a different arrangement of things. The Buggery Act will have been repealed eventually. Eventually, after a long time, the thing you are will not be illegal. It won't get you hanged. It won't get you the pillory. That's a long way away from here. You don't know it's coming. You can't. But you know the room on Thursday afternoons. And the room on Thursday afternoons exists because people who came before you built it, carefully, in the space available to them, with the materials they had. And the people before them built something, and the people before them. The rooms have been different in every generation. Different buildings, different streets, different names, different risks. The room is always the same room. The room is the one where you don't have to calculate. The room where Philip laughs his enormous laugh, and George looks at the ceiling with his heroic unconcern, and Bertram says something quietly devastating. And Will sees everything, and says nothing. And Edward drinks his tea and looks at the middle distance. The room where James puts his hand against your face for a moment. That room is as old as cities. It existed in Rome and in Athens and in Constantinople. It existed in every city that ever had a city's density of people, its necessary anonymity, its rooms within rooms. It existed before it had a name. It will exist after all its current names have changed. You're lying in your bed in London in February 1732, and you're 24 years old, and you're copying clerk to a solicitor in Holborn, and you're one of the people who builds the room, however small the thing you bring to it. The bells are beginning, St. Andrew's first, then the others, cascading east to west, marking the hour somewhere in the middle of the night. You've lost track of which hour. It doesn't matter. Sleep is coming. You can feel it in the edges of your thoughts, the way it arrives when you're genuinely tired rather than anxious, not sudden but certain, the steady approach of rest. The printing press below will begin again at first light. The walk to Addison's will be cold, the coffee will be hot. Will be behind the counter with his appraising eyes that have seen this room for 3 years now, that have seen what comes and what goes, that have seen the room protect itself and open itself and continue. Saturday is the bookshop. James will be there. Let this settle. Let the sounds of the city do what they do, their layered, patient noise, the bells and the dogs and the distant cart and somewhere a child crying briefly and stopping, All of it the sound of people alive in the dark getting through the night. Let your shoulders be down. You're warm enough. Safe enough for now. As safe as this world makes safe. Which is a particular kind of safe, not absolute, not permanent, not without its costs. But for tonight, right now, in this cold room above the printing press with the crack in the plaster and the new coat on the hook, for this hour, enough. You have learned the city. The city is learning you back. Tomorrow you will walk out into February and it will be cold, and the mud will be what mud is in February, and the lamplighter's work will already be over, and the morning will be grey, and your shoulders will go up against the cold. And then the door of Addison's will open, and the smell will come at you, and your shoulders will come down. And the room will be there. The room is always there. That's the thing nobody tells you about this city, about any city, about the whole human project of finding your people in a world that doesn't always want you to find them. The room doesn't announce itself. It doesn't advertise. It doesn't send letters or print broadsheets. It just continues from year to year and decade to decade and century to century in whatever building and by whatever signal and with whatever new generation of people learning to read the room for what it is. You found it. You are in it. Sleep now. The church bells are finished with their marking of the hour. The night opens back into its regular sounds. The crack in the plaster is the same crack it has always been. The printing press waits below, patient for the morning. James will be in the bookshop on Saturday. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the city do its night work without you. Let your hands rest. The copying can wait. The cold can wait. The calculation, the constant careful calibration of every room, of every look and every word and every second spent at a table with your back to the wall, all of it can pause for these hours while you sleep. You earn this rest. You've been in London 2 years and 2 months, and you've learned what it is to live in this city in this particular way, with this particular cost and this particular gift. You've sat in the room, you've learned the park, you've been cold and careful and watchful, and occasionally, briefly, in a corner of a bookshop or at a table with a cup of coffee, you've been completely and entirely here. That's not nothing. Take the rest. Let London breathe you into sleep, the same as it breathed Thomas Marsh into sleep 294 years ago, the same as it breathes you tonight. Some things don't change. The need for the room doesn't change. The cost of building it doesn't change. The relief of being in it doesn't change. The human heart doesn't change. Let yours be quiet now. Let the sounds go soft. Let the dark be just the dark. Good night.